Can I add my welcome to Australia to the Deputy Secretary-General. My few remarks will comment on a number of the issues which we've heard the Deputy Secretary-General make this afternoon, as well as providing some more immediate perspective on the events here in Australia, which bear on the proposition that's put in the title of our forum this afternoon, Problems of Today, World of Tomorrow, and I'll conclude by making a couple of comments which relate even more directly to the events of the last 4 or 5 hours here in Australia, both in Canberra and in the decisions of the Reserve Bank. However we want to identify the need to respond, we need to accurately diagnose the nature of the problem. We also require a realistic understanding of our global and regional place and our industry profile. Here in Australia, we need to have a strong comprehension that in the context of a national economic crisis, the likes of which almost all in business have never seen before in their business life, we have to appreciate the size and scale of our economy. That is, a commodity-based economy, a middle-ranking economy, an economy that is deeply enmeshed in globalisation, an economy that has significantly benefited from globalisation and the living standards that have accrued from our integration in world trade, and therefore, as a result of those features, our capacity to be buffeted in a substantial way by what is happening globally. I'd very much agree with what the Deputy Secretary-General said about the place that we start here in Australia. We start with strong fundamentals, and I think that is very broadly recognised in the Australian community. There are strong economic fundamentals, fundamentals in terms of the government and the fiscal bottom line. The nature of our institutional structures are strong and have withstood the buffeting. The nature of our financial institutions have withstood a buffeting the likes of which no one anticipated. And so we are in a position where there are a range of policy levers available to us, and that also contributes to the strength in which we enter this and are dealing with this crisis. But the downside risks are real. Not only the risks that flow from what I said was a real appreciation of the size and scale of our economy, but also, as the Deputy Secretary-General said, risks in terms of our reliance on foreign credit, and also risks in terms of the terms of trade, given our exposure to international commodities. Obviously, we are seeing a financial crisis play out into the real economy. And if there's one message that we take, even from the developments of the last few hours, it is that the scale and the depth of the economic challenges we face are substantially greater than even what we were discussing back in October or November of last year, in the early weeks after the financial crisis hit. We're seeing that just through the revisions in forecasts from the International Monetary Fund, from what the Deputy Secretary-General said this afternoon about the OECD's subsequent statements that will flow in respect of the global outlook and outlook here in Australia. The policy responses that we need to have regard to are obviously policy responses that need to address both short-term and medium-term issues. You know, in a narrow business sense, businesses are very well advised to look at cost pressures and reducing the cost pressures on doing business, and obviously to address cash flow issues. Our responses in a broader policy term, in a macro term, need to not just be based on short-term thinking, but obviously trying to set ourselves up in the medium term so that we have a strong, indeed stronger economy as we ultimately come out of this serious economic downturn. The policy responses need to be globally integrated, and there are also a range of measures which need to be specifically domestically focused. And it's axiomatic to say in this context that the solutions are neither single nor simple. But past lessons are useful markers, lessons that we can take from the way we withstood the Asian downturn of the late 90s and early 2000s, and also the lessons that we take out of what occurred in the recession of the early 1990s, both lessons in terms of the operation of fiscal policy, monetary policy, and also the way in which our labour market responded to government policy. It's clear there are a range of things that we must not do in this environment. The wait-and-see approach doesn't work, and we see governments, our own government, moving very deliberately, very clearly in a way to deal with domestic policy settings. We see unprecedented action by central banks, some coordinated, some on an individual basis. And that means that we're learning at least some of the lessons of the recession of the early 90s, where we moved too late to alter domestic policy settings. We also need to ensure that we don't undermine confidence, because ultimately it's business confidence and consumer confidence that will play a substantial part in turning this situation around. And so language, even language from people like myself, is important. The way in which government presents policy and policy measures is important, because we don't want to create a self-fulfilling prophecy where by virtue of our own language we actually make matters worse. I think we're in a position where we need to be pragmatic. Leaving it all to the private sector is clearly not going to work, but leaving it all to the public sector to do the heavy lifting in this environment won't either. And this is a real test of the capacity of the public sector to undertake a role which ultimately drives private sector activity. Because ultimately it will be the private sector and the restoration of confidence and business activity and capital flows in the private sector that will drive us out of the situation that we are in. But the triggers for that, in part, will come from the policy settings and decisions made by governments and the work of the public sector. Clearly, thinking short-term will be a major mistake. The Deputy Secretary-General cautioned against a return to protectionist sentiment, and I strongly echo that sentiment, because a call towards inward protectionism, either in our trading markets or in our labour markets, is, particularly in Australian context, but I would argue in a global context, a recipe for stagnation, not a recipe for a growth agenda, which is clearly the agenda we need to embark upon if we're going to restore our living standards and not have our living standards threatened in the way in which they are. And let me conclude my remarks then by just focusing specifically on a couple of the perspectives from today's events. The government, the Australian government, has announced a $42 billion stimulus package, which is based heavily around infrastructure investment, and also around direct stimulus of economic activity through a range of payments made to individuals in the community. The Reserve Bank has reduced interest rates, or the official cash rate, by a further 1%, making a 4% reduction in Australian interest rates in the course of the past 5 months. Official cash rate 3.25%. I think the first thing to say is that we're seeing a synergy between monetary and fiscal policy responses, and that sends itself a good message. That the policy regulators and those who make critical decisions in this environment are making decisions which have regard for what one another is doing. But the basic question is, do we need what occurred today? Can we afford it? And are we spending money on the right things? Well, I think the way to answer the question is, those three questions is, yes, well, we clearly do need it. All of the indicators are suggesting to us that this is potentially deeper and longer than we had anticipated. Can we afford it? A very good question. Another way of putting the question is to say, can we not afford to do it? And I think the answer to that is, yes, we cannot afford not to do this. Can we afford $42 billion when our budgets are under pressure? When the government yesterday announces a $115 billion hit on revenues? Well, we need to do what we're doing. But we also need to ensure that we don't take our eye off the structural economic reforms that are necessary, both in terms of our budget and in terms of our economy. And if we keep an eye on the structural reforms, things that we know from history are going to, or recent history in particular, are going to add value to our economic activity, then I think we can afford it. And finally, are we spending on the right things? Well, by and large, the sorts of things that the government is doing, the combination of direct stimulus and infrastructure spending, are the right things. We can always argue and debate and should discuss around the edges the content of particular measures and particular packages. But the government, by and large, is pressing the right buttons with what it's done today. Finally, let me just leave you with a question to ponder, one that I'm pondering every day now. And that is, what are the triggers for bringing us out of this economic challenge? Are the triggers here in our region? Is it going to be our region particularly which is going to be able to drive the world economy out of this crisis? Are there things that we particularly can do, both in terms of our regional work and our domestic work, which are going to make a difference beyond conventional orthodoxy? These are difficult questions. We don't have the answers to them. They're not readily at hand. We're in some uncharted waters. But I think that the more that we apply our minds to those questions, keep asking ourselves and searching for those answers, and use the resources that are available to us here in our institutions in the OECD, then we have the best prospects of coming out of this in a shorter space of time and in a way that does as little damage to our community and to our business community and those that are so heavily buffeted by what is clearly a very undesirable economic environment in which we're now operating. Thanks very much.
Distinguished guests may or may not know that the Pope was here in Sydney last year, and as a result, confessions are back in fashion. And I was going to start my talk just by making 4 confessions in that spirit. My first confession is, like Amy Winehouse and Ben Cousins, I'm a bit of a junkie. I'm actually a PowerPoint junkie, and I'm actually going to try speaking today without slides, without pictures of Megan Gale and movie stars, and actually speak to you the old-fashioned way. So remember, I've just been to rehab, and I'm going to try today. Second confession. Look, I have a very aristocratic French surname, Harcourt, and I'm a regular visitor to the OECD. It's very handy being called Harcourt when you're at the OECD. They think you're French, they look after you very well. There's a castle up in the north of France called Chateau d'Harcourt, and I go up there in my summers. I saw my long-lost relative, spend about 6 weeks there every year, which is all very good. But I must confess it's all a bit of a fraud. My ancestry is actually Transylvanian. I'm a Harkovits, not a Harcourt. My great-grandfather, Israel Harkovits, actually came from Transylvania, which I thought was a made-up country, but it's actually sometimes Hungary, sometimes Romania. If I'm with Frank Lowy, I'm definitely Hungarian. And Israel Harkovits actually came from Transylvania and ended up living quite near the university. And his son, my grandfather, Kopel Harkovits, grew up in Bondi. And he was actually from a religious family, and his mother wanted him to be a rabbi. And he didn't want to be a rabbi for 2 reasons. One is he was an atheist, which is a bit of an occupational hazard if you want to be a rabbi. And secondly, he used to play hooky from the yeshiva each day and watch the great Bondi Lifesavers, which is a bit of an icon here in Australia. And he tried to get into the lifesaving club in the 1920s, and he said, "G'day, I'm Kopel Harkovits, I'd like to be a lifesaver." And they said at the club, "Well, no thanks, Kopel, we don't need any, life-saving rabbis right now. Don't call us, we'll call you." So he went and changed his name to Ken Harcourt. He went back the next week and said, "G'day, I'm Ken Harcourt, I want to be a lifesaver." And they said, "Beauty, Ken, we're looking for people. In you go." And he became a lifesaver. And some of you may know that there was a very famous economist called Harry Markowitz who won the Nobel Prize for Economics for writing about a hedge fund that later went broke. But the good thing about the Nobel Prize is you don't have to give it back. And when Harry Markowitz won the Nobel Prize, I rang up my pop and said, Markowitz, we're 1 letter off. "Why did you change the name, Pop?" And he said, "Well, I didn't really change the name, I just left the Goldbergs so I could join the icebergs." And that's why he did it. And of course, some of his descendants did get onto the Randwick racecourse last year when the Pope was here and they had to evacuate it. But at Randwick, where I live, they've solved that problem. They've put up a rabbi-proof fence, so that's not going to happen anymore. Third confession, like our distinguished guest, I also worked for the trade union movement before Austrade. Our special guest worked for the Christian trade union movement in the Netherlands. And I worked for the broad church of the trade union movement in Australia under St Bill Kelty and Brother Martin Ferguson, Sister Jenny George and the Cardinal Greg Combe. And I've got to say that it's actually good that we have had trade union experience in the economy, in the OECD. As many of you will know, the trade union movement played a very important role in making sure Australia was competitive and will be able to weather the storm that's upon us now with the global financial crisis. The final confession is, as John alluded to, I'm a bit of an airport economist. Look, I did bring my book along. I was told it's bad form at a university to plug your book. I usually do this on Kerry Ann Kennelly or Sunrise, but you have got a TV camera here, so I'll hold it up for a minute. Basically, my book is about travelling around the world, and I think I've been to about 45 countries in 4 years. So people say to me, "What do you think of Brazil? What do you think of Russia? What do you think of Hungary?" And I say, well, the airport looked pretty good, but here's my prognosis. And Julia Gillard, the Deputy Prime Minister, launched this book last year in Sydney. The Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, was overseas, which is unusual. But Julia launched it. At the time, she was Minister for Industrial Relations, Minister for Education, and Acting Prime Minister. So I got a bit worried. I thought, she's not going to make my book launch. She's so busy. So I rang up the ACCU and said, "No strikes, thanks." I rang up the Vice-Chancellors and said, "Just take it easy tonight." And they were very good, and the book got launched by Julie. She showed up, spent a couple of hours, was fantastic. And after that, there were lots of strikes. And the good thing is that if you do have an airport book at the airport, lots of strikes is good because people are wandering around airports. Qantas is slow. They're buying your book. And I did manage to get it into Bangkok Airport before they shut it down with the pro-democracy march. So that's good news too. There may not have been a canary in a coal mine, but there was a very loud squawking budgie in the form of Dr. Adrian Blundell-Wignall from the OECD, well before Lehman Brothers, well before the election of the Rudd government, well before the Democratic primaries took off between Obama and Hillary Clinton. I visited Adrian Blundell-Wignall in Paris. The Rugby World Cup was on in Paris, and you do what you've got to do as an airport economist. And Blundell-Wignall explained to me the actual workings of the subprime crisis and how it would impact the real economy. So I think the OECD doesn't need to be too modest, because they did have that research and they did tell as many people as they could. And Adrian himself told everyone, particularly in Sydney, from his work in the financial markets, what the causes were. So perhaps the OECD did pick it up, and certainly an Australian economist did. And that's something the OECD, I think, can be proud of. But cause is one thing, policy response is another, and probably the most important. The question is, how did it occur? Or the other question, to coin a phrase, what is to be done? I think you need to know both. And I think when you, as Peter said, analyse the causes of the crisis, I think in many ways the policy responses have been appropriate. As the Deputy Director General said, it's important that we have a role for fiscal and monetary policy. Australia's been very quick on both counts, we've heard, in terms of fiscal strategy today, and the Reserve Bank, Glenn Stevens, has led the way in terms of expansionary monetary policy. Secondly, I agree, policies need to be coordinated together. The last thing we need is what's occurred during past global downturns, such as in the 1930s, when countries try beggar thy neighbour policies, whether it be protectionism, providing different fiscal strategies that are out of sync, or manipulating their exchange rates to get competitive advantage over each other. And I think the OECD is right to point that out. And finally, I agreed with a very substantial part of our guest talk on the important economic and social implications of the crisis and how you should look after social equity for social reasons and for economic reasons. After all, we know there's going to be unemployment with this crisis. We know that this will affect people drastically socially, and it will also have economic effects. Losing human capital, losing the future productivity gains because people are out of work, not only creates social misery, but it also causes very, very poor economic problems that we all need to take care of. And let's face it, I mean, the workers of the world didn't cause this crisis. The wages blowout was on Wall Street, it wasn't on Main Street. And it's very important, as we know from economic history, that we need to maintain social safety nets and very strong labour market institutions to make sure people aren't hurt, and also we hold up the future productivity gains of our economy. And in fact, from an Australian point of view, economic history can really help us make the right policy response in terms of Australia. When I was a student, I studied a lot of the Great Depression through Ben Bernanke's work, the current Fed Governor, an economic historian, and also Boris Shedvin, who wrote Australia and the Great Depression, published by the University of Sydney. And when you look at economic writing before the Great Depression, when there was a very new economics profession in Australia, and what happened at the 30s, you saw that the policy response was actually the wrong one. In the 1930s, they did three things. The first thing they did through the Premier's plan is that they cut spending, because they thought that having a balanced budget or a budget surplus would help. It didn't. The arbitration court cut the basic wage, and that had a terrible effect on consumption and incomes in the economy. Finally, they jacked up tariffs. They basically thought protecting industry would what we all need to get out of the Depression, and we saw the damage that did, not only to Australia, but also to the rest of the world in the trade wars that follow. Now, I think governments have learnt in the OECD, in the emerging world, and in Australia. And I think we're wiser from the experience. So the policy response has been appropriate. Appropriate fiscal policy, expansionary monetary policy, making sure policies are aligned, and making sure that we have a commitment to free trade and openness. I think this is important not only for the world, but also for Australia. One of the first studies I did when I went from the ACCU to Austrade was looking at the performance of exporting companies as employers. And in fact, this article was published by the OECD Observer. And what it showed is that on average, as the economy becomes more open, exporters become more profitable, more productive. They raise wages, they provide better health and safety, more employment rights for women, and they actually provide a more stable floor under the economy. And that evidence is very important. How will Australia and advanced Australia fare with this environment? Certainly, 12 months ago, we're in the middle of a long boom with very low unemployment, enjoying the resources boom. When you look at the data, Western Australia, Queensland doing very well. I'm not even including Brian Burke's lunch money. You can see Western Australia's revenues doing very well. Now, 12 months on, we've got a reversal of fortune, if you like, with respect to our terms of trade. But, as Peter has said, and also our special guest has said, we have got very good foundations. Reform has helped us. Thank goodness, I think, for the opening up of the economy, the floating of the exchange rate, and the financial and labour market reforms that have taken place in Australia. It's 25 years just after since the float of the Australian dollar. The economists in Sydney had a party to celebrate. You think economists don't have a social life? Well, there's proof for you. But when Paul Keating floated the dollar, if you read Paul Keating's memoirs, Bob Hawke floated the dollar if you read his, or I've looked at the Latham diaries and you can't find any mention of it. But that decision basically meant that Australia was an open economy and the world didn't owe us a living. And I think we did this. I mean, in many ways, the lucky country made its own luck, and we did this right at the time when the emerging economies became very important. And I think Peter referred to the tyranny of distance. I think the power of proximity with respect to the emerging economies is going to help us. And you can see that at the micro level too. Australian exporters actually bounced back very quickly from the Asian financial crisis. It was a V-shaped recovery rather than a U-shaped, and many actually have got very strong foundations in the labour market, in productivity and innovation that will ensure that they're in a good position. Now, I agree with our speaker. It's important to keep an eye on the long term, whether it be climate change, and environmental exports is an important part of our brand, demographic change, and also improving Australia's own trade and investment resources offshore. I think that it's very important that Australia support the OECD and support the emerging economies to make sure that the Doha round remains on track. Simon Crean's played a very strong role at Davos, and we don't want to see the WTO ending up as dead as the Doha. That's very important indeed for the world. The last thing I want to say is that the OECD's actually played a very important role in finding solutions to the global financial crisis. I was at a seminar on the Gold Coast yesterday, an exporting seminar, and a couple of people said, there's all these people, economists and politicians out there, talking and thinking. But I actually think ideas play a very important role in basically finding a solution to the recovery. If you think of two famous people in British history, John Maynard Keynes, the British economist, said that every practical businessman or woman has an academic scribbler influencing them, influencing their ideas, influencing their confidence. And it's said that Winston Churchill won the war just by talking about it. So I think putting ideas on the table, talking about it, thinking about it, in the way that the OECD has done, will be play a very important role in how we respond to the global financial crisis, what has been said has been the worst crisis since World War II. So I congratulate the OECD and the leadership role it has played in Australia and elsewhere. Thank you.